Good morning to all of you for what is perhaps the class before the last to finish our readings. So, we have left Kant's text from religion within the limits of reason alone. So, of course, question of religion and reason, and how religion can be maintained within the horizon of reason. I think between then today and next time, which I trust is next Monday, because the 1st of May is a holiday, we shall cover this. So please open your books on page 125. Preface to the first edition. So this is again from religion within the limits of reason alone. Grenzen, limits. I start from the beginning, and as usual, I'll do the most important passages. So you'll follow with me. Kant says then, to start, so far as morality is based on the conception of the human being as one who is free, but who also, just because of that, binds himself through his reason to unconditional laws, it is in need neither of the idea of another being above him in order that he recognize his duty, nor that he observe it of an incentive other than the law itself. At least it is the human being's own fault if such a need is found in him, such a lack. But in this case too, the need could not be relieved through anything else. For whatever does not originate from himself and his own freedom provides no remedy for a lack in his morality. Hence, on its own behalf, morality in no way needs religion, whether objectively as regards willing or subjectively as regards capability, but is rather self-sufficient by virtue of pure practical reason. For since its laws bind through the mere form of universal lawfulness of the maxims to be adopted in accordance with this lawfulness as the highest condition, itself unconditional of all ends, morality needs absolutely no material determining ground of the free power of choice. There is no end either in order to recognize what duty is or to impel its performance. On the contrary, when duty is the issue, morality can perfectly well abstract from ends altogether and ought so to do. For example, to know whether I should or even can be truthful in my testimony before a court of justice, or faithful when someone else's goods entrusted to me are being reclaimed, there is no need to demand an end which I might perhaps propose to myself to realize by my declaration. For what sort of end this would be does not matter at all. Rather, one who still finds it necessary to look around for some end when his testimony is rightfully demanded of him is in this respect already contemptible. All right. What is Kant telling us basically here? First, when I comment on this, and as you read this, I take it for granted that you studied the two passages we worked on together, both from the Critique of Pure Reason. The one was the Copernican Revolution from the second introduction, and the second was the Transcendental Aesthetics. So normally you know the system of Kant, how Kant thinks rationality works. So if you have any questions, any problems with what we're doing and some references today, go back please to the classes. There are several, as you know, I think 3 or 4, where we dealt with this. So now to get back to our text today. What is Kant saying? Basically, of course, morality itself as such does not need religion. What is he telling us about morality? Why doesn't it need religion? He's saying morality is based, of course, on the fact that we are autonomous, free. Autonomous means, and autonomy is a very important term in Kant, autonomy means that nothing else determines the person from outside. If something else determines the person from outside, then they are no longer autonomous. To give you an example, as I usually do, if I am going to help someone who is poor, I do it out of duty alone, not because this someone helped me before. Or if I choose not to help him because he killed somebody who's dear to me, again, this is an influence from something outside. In which case, I'm not being autonomous, I'm letting something empirical come into play in my decisions. So, morality itself is based on the conception of the human as a free agent. And so, that means, again, he's autonomous. It means he only follows his reason. So he only follows the unconditional laws. It means they are not conditioned by something else, from something outside reason. Unconditional laws. Laws coming only from reason, which is, of course, then universal. In which case, if morality then comes to us from following the unconditional laws of reason, it doesn't need the idea of another being above. So, of course, God, this is what is meant here. In order that we recognize our duty, reason itself gives us duty. And it doesn't need either that he observe it of an incentive other than the law itself. So we don't need to observe the law for other reasons than the law. We don't need to be just in conformity with the law. We need to follow and do acts coming from this law. Okay? So, because reason then contains all the unconditional laws, there is no need either to speak of something above it, a God, nor to speak of other conditions that determine it, since it's unconditional. Nothing determines this law. Okay? So, because then morality functions in this way, we can say that morality is entirely a question of practical reason. What is practical reason? Kant writes 3 critiques: the critique of judgment, the critique of pure reason. The third one he writes is critique of judgment, the first one critique of pure reason, and between them the critique of practical reason. Practical here has to be clearly understood. Practical comes from praxis in Greek, if you like, and it means action. So when Kant studies the critique of pure reason, when he writes the critique of pure reason, from which we studied 2 excerpts, he's talking more theoretically, what things we can know, what is our knowledge based on. When reason is seen in its practical aspect, then it is reason not only that knows, but reason that spurs us to action, right? And of course, since every time you act in the world, others are involved, it is a moral question. So practical reason means the reason that is the foundation for our morality. Okay. Kant speaks here too of maxims that are determined by these laws of reason. What is a maxim? A maxim is a rule, is a rule of action. It is a rule of action, and that is between, if you like, the act that we are going to do in the empirical world and the law, the universal law of reason, and the imperatives it poses on us. The imperatives of course, that found our duty. Duty, don't forget, has the idea of something imperative, right? Hence, what's called Kant's categorical imperative. Okay. So, reason by itself then, because it has all these laws that can be the foundation for our maxims, for how we act in the world, does not need anything else. It has the foundation of morality within itself, so it doesn't need religion, it doesn't need to founding God with positive laws and so on and so forth. All right. Now please go with me, we're going to speak of the notion of end to page 126. And about the middle of the page, you see there's on the left 6.5. We start there to read. So we're skipping to there. Kant says, so morality really has no need of an end for right conduct. On the contrary, the law that contains the formal condition of the use of freedom in general suffices to it. Yet, an end proceeds from morality just the same, for it cannot possibly be a matter of indifference to reason how to answer the question, what is then the result of this right conduct of ours? Nor to what we are to direct our doings or non-doings, even granted this is not fully in our control, at least as something with which they are to harmonize. And this is indeed only the idea of an object that unites within itself the formal condition of all such ends, as we ought to have duty, with everything which is conditional upon ends we have and which conforms to duty, happiness proportioned to its observance. That is the idea of a highest good in the world, for whose possibility we must assume a higher moral, most holy and omnipotent being who alone can unite the two elements of this good. This idea, now I jump 5 lines, this idea rises out of morality and is not its foundation. That is, that it is an end which to make one's own already presupposes ethical principles. So this idea cannot be a matter of indifference, or in general, it cannot be a matter of indifference to morality, therefore, whether it does or does not fashion for itself the concept of an ultimate end of all things. Before I continue, let's try to understand what Kant is doing here. First, we have to understand the notion of end, and to do so, go with me again to the beginning of this paragraph, still page 126. Although on its own behalf, morality does not need the representation of an end, which would have to precede the determination of the will, it may well be that it has a necessary reference to such an end, not as the ground of its maxims, but as a necessary consequence accepted in conformity to its maxims. For in the absence of all reference to an end, no determination of the will can take place in human beings at all. What is Kant doing? An end. Kant is, of course, thinking of the Greek word, telos, which we find in Aristotle. The Greek word telos. Fortunately, we didn't read Aristotle. Telos is translated often as end, and what is meant here is purpose, target, hadaf. Okay, this is what end. Doesn't mean the finishing of something. It means what we want to go toward. Now, because Kant is saying that morality is founded on laws from reason, laws from reason do not provide an end as such, right? The law of reason gives you a categorical imperative. It means it gives you amr. That is the foundation of your duty, an imperative. And this is expressed in a maxim. As I told you, the maxim is a rule of action. So to give you an example, Kant formulates several formulas for the categorical imperative. The second one he gives, for example, just so you can understand how maxims work, act in such a way, Kant says, that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another person, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. Okay? So I speak again. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person, because we all have humanity in us, or in that of another, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. We find something like this in the Declaration of Human Rights, right? So this is a categorical imperative that comes from the application of the law of reason. As you see, there is no specific end here. We don't have someone in front of us, or we don't have a building in front of us. We don't have an institution in front of us. We don't have one specific act happening in front of us, one specific event, right? It's not a question of end. It is given universally, okay? The categorical imperative is universal. Now, Kant, of course, says this is the foundation, but of course, once we are going to act in the world, there is going to be an end. This is why I read for you again the middle of the paragraph. So morality has no need of an end for right conduct, right? It needs the right maxim, founded, right categorical imperative coming from reason. So morality really has no need of an end for right conduct. On the contrary, the law that contains the formal condition of the use of freedom in general suffices to it. So when we are giving this categorical imperative, which, if you want, I read again, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. So we are not going to use others, to use humanity to get what we want. No, humanity is itself an end. We have to respect it as such, in general, universally. Okay? And I read again then, morality has no need of an end for right conduct. On the contrary, the law that contains the formal condition of the use of freedom, so this maxim tells us how to use freedom, in general, it suffices it. But of course, an end proceeds, as I told you, from morality just the same. For it cannot possibly be a matter of indifference to reason how to answer the question, what is then the result of this right conduct of ours? Okay. So of course, when we follow this maxim that I read to you, act in such a way, etc., etc., of course there are going to be results. And this has to be examined. This has to be examined by reason. So it is not indifferent what results from the application of the categorical imperative. We must ask every time, what is the result of our actions? Okay? And I continue the next sentence that we read, and this is indeed only the idea of an object that unites within itself the formal condition of all such ends as we ought to have. Now, so it's not a matter of indifference to reason how we answer this question, nor to what we are to direct our doings or non-doings, even granted this is not fully in our control, at least as something with which they are to harmonize. So we are directing our doings and non-doings towards something with which our actions have to harmonize. And this is, for him, the idea of an object that unites within itself, I'm reading, the formal condition of all such ends as we ought to have, with everything which is conditional upon ends we have and which conforms to duty, happiness, proportion to its observers. That is the idea of a highest good in the world, for whose possibility we must assume a higher moral, most holy and omnipotent being who alone can unite the two elements of this good, duty, happiness, proportion to its observance, and so on. Okay? So Kant is saying, of course, there is no need for an end from the law of reason and the categorical imperative to have the right conduct. But there is a result. And an end then proceeds from the fact that we act upon the world. And then we have in us to think, Kant says, that all those ends concur, harmonize, conform to duty and are done from duty. Right? I reread. This is indeed only the idea of an object that unites within itself the formal condition of all such ends as we ought to have. Okay? So there is a condition, formal, not material, so coming from reason, so obeying all the maxims of reason, of all the things that we ought to reach, all the ends that we ought to have. In other words, this is doing our duty, doing what duty is imposed by reason. So there is an object, he says, that would unite in it, that would give all the formal conditions of this. In addition to that, everything which is conditional upon ends we have and which conforms to duty. So in addition to that, everything which we do in our lives, ends we reach in our lives, and which are in conformity with duty. So happiness, he says, proportioned to its observance. So happiness, when happiness is brought into contact, into harmonization, if you like, with the observance of duty, coming from the observance of duty. And he says that is the idea of a highest good in the world, for whose possibility we must assume a higher, moral, most holy and omnipotent being who alone can unite the two elements of this good. So, of course, that means we must assume that there is a higher being that has in it, that unites in it, everything that we respect as everything, in fact, that we would consider as formal condition of duty, and everything done in conformity with duty. And we may call this God. Okay? The idea, in other words, for Kant, of a moral, most holy, and most powerful, omnipotent being. And that is, of course, God. I jump 4 lines. What is most important here, however, is that this idea rises out of morality and is not its foundation. Next sentence. It cannot be a matter of indifference to morality, therefore, whether it does or does not fashion for itself the concept of an ultimate end to all things. Jump with me to page 127. Line 4, page 127. Assume a human being who honors the moral law and who allows himself to think, as he can hardly avoid doing, what sort of world he would create were this in his power, under the guidance of practical reason, a world within which, moreover, he would place himself as a member. Now, not only would he choose a world precisely as the moral idea of the highest good requires, if the choice were entrusted to him alone, but he would also want the very existence of such a world, since the moral law wills that the highest good possible through us be actualized, even though in following this idea he might see himself in danger of giving up, forfeiting much in the way of personal happiness. For it is possible that he might not be adequate to what reason makes the condition for it. He would thus feel himself compelled by reason to acknowledge this judgment with complete impartiality, as if rendered by somebody else, yet at the same time his own. And in this way, the human being brings out the need effected in him by morality of adding to the thought of his duties an ultimate end as well as their consequence. Morality, thus, inevitably leads to religion, and through religion it extends itself to the idea of a mighty moral lawgiver outside the human being, in whose will the ultimate end of the creation of the world is what can and at the same time ought to be the ultimate human end. What is Kant saying? A moral being, then, as we said, follows the moral laws of reason expressed in the categorical imperative for his action and the maxims for his action. And a moral being always wants to reach then ends that come as results of the application of these maxims. Okay? I'm going to be very clear because things were a bit complicated for you. So listen very well here. Again, a moral being then follows the law of reason, the laws of reason, which are formulated then in maxims, as the categorical imperative, as what you must do. You don't have the choice not to do it if you are a moral being. Otherwise, you are not a moral being. And when we do this, every time there are results. In other words, there are ends we reach. So, of course, moral being always wants to reach these ends. Moral ends, we may call them. So the more we reach these ends, the more we want. And of course, we have a higher end, and then a higher end, a higher target and a higher target. And we go up and up and up. Our will is good because we are following these laws, right? And then we reach these ends. And of course, we want a highest end. All these coming together, moral and moral and moral things. Of course, the moral being wants basically a moral world. So there is an ultimate end. The highest end is the consequence of following our duties more and more and more. If I am someone who is moral agent and is a moral person and doing then my duties in this manner, if I have some money, I help my neighbor. If somebody's suffering, I take them to the doctor. If my parents need help, I help them. If my colleagues need help, I help them. If fellow students need me to go to their house to explain a point of philosophy from this class, I go and explain it to them. If I have more money as I go on, I create institutions, I help with associations. So more and more, I'm developing myself as a moral agent with more and more ends toward a moral world, toward the highest end, where everything would, in possibility, be moral. So we have an ultimate end of this, and we have an object that unites in it all those ends. And this is why Kant says morality inevitably leads, because of all these ends we want to reach a moral world, to religion. Morality thus inevitably leads to religion, and through religion it extends itself to the idea of a mighty lawgiver outside the human being, in whose will the ultimate end, so of the creation of the world, is what can and at the same time ought to be the ultimate human end. Okay. An ultimate end of the creation of a world in which morality is present, in which more and more people would be moral, should be the ultimate end of us, the human end, and so the ultimate end that coincides with that of God in his creation of the world. Note, however, that Kant is calling this an idea. He's calling God an idea. He's not speaking about the existence of God here. Idea. I reread, morality thus inevitably leads to religion, and through religion, morality extends itself to the idea, okay, of a mighty moral lawgiver outside the human being, in whose will the ultimate end of the creation of the world is what can and at the same time ought to be the ultimate human end, which is what? A moral end. The moral end, the ultimate moral end. So we have an idea of God, and necessarily for Kant, morality leads to this. So what is the idea of God? It is not God as existing, or God as he is propounded in laws, in positive laws that means laws that are put by humans in different religions. It is the idea of a God who gives us a moral law outside of us. And in this law, the ultimate end is also the ultimate human end. The ultimate end of creation is the ultimate human end, which is moving toward a universal moral world. We end today with the next passage, page 128. If morality recognizes in the holiness of its law an object worthy of highest respect, at the level of religion, it represents an object of worship in the highest cause that brings this law to fruition, and thus morality appears in its majesty. Everything, however, even the most sublime object, is diminished under the hands of human beings whenever they apply its idea to their use. That which can be venerated truthfully only so far as respect for it is free is forced to accommodate itself to forms which can be given authority only through coercive laws. And that which of itself exposes itself to the public criticism of all must submit to a criticism which has coercive power, that is to say, it has to a censorship. So, morality then sees in its law, we know where this law comes from, the law of reason, expressed in the categorical imperative, something holy. It means something sacred that is to preserve us, from Heil also in German. Heil. Heilige comes from Heil, what is whole, entire. So morality recognizes in the holiness of its law and what preserves us as moral being, something that we have to have a feeling of respect for, worthy of the highest respect. And at the level of religion, morality also represents an object, because we are going now into religion, an object of worship in the highest cause that brings this law to fruition. It sees in religion a God, highest cause, that makes this law come into being, and thus morality appears in its majesty. We stop here because there is a problem with it, of course, that sometimes even the most sublime object, Kant says, is diminished under the hands of human beings whenever they apply this idea to their use. I let you reflect on this. Okay? So morality leads to religion because it has ends. Let's be very simple to finish today. When we want to reach more and more of these ends, we want an ultimate end of things. This ultimate end of things then leads us to the idea of God that unites in it everything that is good, and the ultimate end that this God would have, this idea of God would have, is that, of course, as the ultimate end of humanity, morality. All right. We will stop here today. We'll move to the next few pages next time, probably skipping a bit more. And meanwhile, I wish you a good week. I must tell you that once again, the exam is on May 15th from 11 to 1. Please go on Moodle through the university website, students, Moodle. Make sure you are registered in the class because the exam will be on Moodle for 2 hours. Make sure then on the 15th you are in a place with internet. I know I keep repeating this. The exam will only be on what we didn't do in the first midterm. I will give you more specific texts later. So it is not comprehensive. We received the decision of the dean yesterday. So it's not a comprehensive exam. Meanwhile, stay safe and I'll speak to you next time.